Welcome to the Veil of Truth, your gateway to uncovering hidden insights and illuminating mysteries. I'm thrilled you've joined our global community. Whether you're watching from a bustling city skyline or a quiet countryside, we're glad you're here. Globe showing Europe, Africa, so tell me, where are you tuning in from today? Chapter 1: The Silent Death. Bellmere House did not look like the sort of place where a man should die in peace. It sat on a low hill above winter grass, the color of weak tea, with bare trees arranged like watchful servants along the drive. The sky was the heavy pewter of an English evening, and the wind kept its own counsel, slipping around the corners of the building as if it knew a secret and was reluctant to share it. Hercule Poirot arrived in a hired motorcar that looked slightly ashamed of its own noise. He stepped out with care, smoothing his coat and adjusting his scarf in a small act of defiance against the chill. Even in the countryside, even in tragedy, order must be maintained. His moustache was immaculate. His gloves were clean. His eyes, dark, bright, and quietly alert, took in everything at once. A housekeeper opened the door before Poirot had time to knock, as though she had been standing there, listening for the sound of his tires. "Mr. Poirot," she asked, her voice low. "But of course," Poirot said gently. "You have been expecting me." "Yes, sir." She hesitated. "Inspector Webb is inside." Poirot followed her through a hall that was too neat. Not tidy in the ordinary sense, but arranged with a strange precision, as if the house had been prepared for inspection. There were no coats thrown over chairs, no muddy shoes by the door, no newspapers left half-read. It was the sort of cleanliness one associates with guilt or fear, or a life lived under strict rules. As they walked, Poirot's ears caught the absence of small sounds. No distant laughter. No clink of cutlery. No conversation murmured behind half-closed doors. Even the house seemed to breathe carefully. The housekeeper led him towards a drawing room, but before they reached it, Poirot noticed a small table in the corridor. On it sat a silver tray with a teapot, a cup, and a plate of biscuits, untouched. The tea had been poured and left to cool, and a faint skin had formed at the edge. "Who was this for?" Poirot asked. The housekeeper blinked, as if surprised that he had spoken at all. For Mrs. Harrowby, sir. She doesn't eat much now." Poirot nodded. He did not comment, but he noted the detail, not the tea itself, but the habit of making it, the ritual of care maintained even when appetite and comfort had fled. People clung to rituals when their minds could not settle. At last, they reached the drawing room. Inspector Webb rose from an armchair with a weary politeness. He was a solid man, practical, with the air of someone who preferred crimes that left clear footprints. This case had left none at all. "Monsieur Poirot," Webb said, offering his hand. "I'm glad you came." Poirot shook it, then sat, placing his hat neatly beside him, as though he were attending an ordinary social visit. Only his eyes moved constantly, over the fire, the curtains, the untouched tea things, the way the room had been arranged with too much care. "You will tell me," Poirot said, "exactly what happened. No opinions. No guesses. Only facts." Webb exhaled. "Facts, then." Lionel Harrowby, 48. Owner of Bellmere House. Died 3 nights ago in his music room at 8:17 in the evening. Well, that's the time on the clock when he was found. The clock stopped at 8:17 and hasn't been restarted. It was his habit to wind it himself. "And the cause of death?" Poirot asked. "The doctor says cardiac failure." "Dr. Kersey?" "He's the family physician and was staying here that weekend." Poirot's moustache twitched, the smallest sign of interest. "He was staying here. That is convenient." Webb frowned. "He was invited." There were guests. Harrowby had people to the house. How many? 5 guests. Plus staff. The 5 stayed on after, mostly because the roads were icy and, well, nobody wanted to leave too quickly. Poirot looked at the untouched tea again. Nobody wanted to leave. Or perhaps nobody wished to be alone. Poirot looked at the untouched tea again. Nobody wanted to leave. Or perhaps nobody wished to be alone. Webb continued, flipping through his notes. Harrowby was found seated at the piano. Hands resting on the keys. Head forward, like he'd nodded off. The room was locked from the inside. 1 key. No signs of forced entry. Windows shut, bolts fastened. No poison in his drink, no unusual substances found. Poirot's gaze sharpened. His drink? There was a glass on the side table. Water, we think. Half full. And the piano, Poirot murmured, was it played? That's the odd part, Webb said. Thomas Reed, the pianist, says Harrowby asked him to play something at 8. Reed claims he went to the music room, but Harrowby changed his mind and dismissed him. Reed says he left Harrowby alive. The others say they heard no music at all. Poirot lifted one finger. Already, you see, we have something. A man invites people, he summons a pianist, and yet no music is heard. It is like a meal prepared and never eaten. Webb gave a humorless smile. We've interviewed them all. Their stories line up. Tea at 7. Conversation. Nothing remarkable. Reed says he spoke to Harrowby shortly before 8. At about 8:30, the widow, Mrs. Harrowby, went to check on him because she hadn't seen him. She found the music room door locked. She called for help. Staff fetched the spare key from Harrowby's desk, kept in a drawer in the study, according to them. They unlocked the music room. Harrowby was dead. Poirot's eyes narrowed. The spare key, it was in his study. Who had access? Webb hesitated. Most of them, technically. The study is not locked during the day. But staff say they're told not to enter without permission. The secretary, Margaret Quinn, had reason to be in there. The widow had reason. And Harrowby, of course. Poirot leaned back. He did not speak for a moment. In that pause, the house seemed even quieter, as though it held its breath. Inspector, Poirot said at last, tell me about this man, Monsieur Harrowby. Not the rumors. Not what people think. Tell me what you know. Webb glanced down at his notes. Wealthy. Private. Known to be difficult. He ran his affairs strictly. Fell out with a business partner some years ago but later reconciled, at least on paper. His marriage was tense, according to staff. He kept people close but not comfortable. Poirot's gaze drifted to the fireplace. The fire had been laid with care, each log placed as though an instruction had been followed. Even warmth, it seemed, was controlled in this house. A man who controls, Poirot said softly, also controls the way people feel. And when they cannot control him back, they do something else. What's that? Webb asked. Poirot smiled faintly, but it was not a comforting smile. They withdraw. They become silent. They wait. Webb shifted in his chair. You make it sound like the house itself planned something. No, Poirot said, and the word was gentle but firm. Not the house. People. Always people. He rose. Now, Inspector, you will take me to the music room. I do not wish to hear more words. I wish to see what does not speak. They walked through corridors where portraits watched from the walls. Faces with the same calm expression, polite, controlled, distant. Poirot felt the strange impression that Bellmere House did not permit loud emotion. At the music room door, Webb produced a key. He unlocked it and pushed. The room was elegant. Not cozy, not inviting, but handsome in a way that suggested wealth without warmth. A grand piano stood at the center like an altar. The polished wood reflected the light from the lamps, and the keys looked unnaturally clean. On the mantel sat the clock, frozen at 8:17. And there, at the piano, was the chair where Lionel Harrowby had died. Poirot did not approach at once. He stood in the doorway, letting his eyes move slowly across every detail, the curtain folds, the angle of the chair, the position of a small side table, the glass of water with its faint ring on the polished surface. He stepped inside and stopped again. The air itself seemed wrong, too still, too contained, as though the room had been holding something back. Poirot's voice was almost a whisper. "A man does not die in a locked room by accident," he said. "Not like this. Not with this ceremony." Webb frowned. "But the doctor?" Poirot raised his hand. "We will speak of doctors later." He walked to the clock and examined it closely. No damage. No sign of struggle. Then he looked at the piano keys, still, untouched, waiting. Poirot's eyes softened, and for a moment, the careful detective looked oddly sad. "This is not only a death," he said. "It is a message." Webb stared. "A message to who?" Poirot turned, his gaze sharp again, his mind already building its pattern like a mosaic. "To everyone in this house," Poirot said quietly. And perhaps to the one who believed he was always heard, until, suddenly, he was not. The clock remained stopped. The room remained silent. But Poirot, in the stillness, had begun to hear everything. Chapter 2: The Guests Who Remained. Morning came to Bellmere House reluctantly, as though daylight itself hesitated before entering. A thin grey light filtered through tall windows, revealing polished floors, heavy curtains, and the same careful order that Poirot had noticed the night before. Nothing appeared disturbed. Nothing appeared alive. Poirot took his breakfast alone. The tray was arranged with precision, toast cut evenly, butter placed exactly at the center, coffee poured but barely touched. He noted this too. In a house where everything was prepared, little was consumed. At precisely 9 o'clock, Inspector Webb joined him. "They're ready to speak to you," Webb said. "Individually, as you asked." "Très bien," Poirot replied. "Order is a comfort to those who fear confusion." The interviews were held in the small morning room overlooking the lawn. Poirot chose it deliberately. People revealed more when they believed themselves in daylight and safety. The first to enter was Clara Harrowby. She was a slender woman in her early 40s, dressed entirely in black, though the fabric was fine and new. Her face was pale, carefully composed, but her eyes avoided the mirror above the mantel, as if she did not wish to meet her own reflection. Poirot rose politely. "Madam, my condolences." "Thank you," she said, sitting at once. Her hands folded neatly in her lap. Too neatly. Poirot did not ask about her husband's death. Instead, he asked, "You have lived in this house long?" 8 years, she replied. "Longer than I ever expected." "Did your husband enjoy company?" She paused. Only a second, but Poirot noticed. "He liked control," she said at last. "He liked people to be where he could see them." "And you?" Poirot asked gently. "I liked quiet," she said. "That is not the same thing." Poirot nodded. He asked nothing further. When she left, she did not look back. The second guest was Edmund Vale. Vale entered with an easy smile and an extended hand. He was tall, well-dressed, and carried himself with confidence that felt slightly over-rehearsed. Monsieur Poirot. I've heard quite a bit about you. Poirot accepted the hand but did not mirror the enthusiasm. Then you know I prefer truth to charm. Vale laughed lightly. Of course. Lionel and I go back years. Business partners once. Difficult man, Lionel, but brilliant. Yet you remained friends, Poirot observed. Vale shrugged. Friends is a strong word. Respect, perhaps. One does not easily escape Lionel Harrowby's orbit. Poirot's eye sharpened. Escape? Vale waved a hand. I only mean, he was persuasive. And the evening of his death. Entirely ordinary, Vale said at once. Tea, polite talk. No tension. I retired early. I heard nothing. Poirot smiled faintly. Vale smiled back, too quickly. The third guest, Margaret Quinn, entered quietly and closed the door behind her with care. She carried a small notebook, which she placed on the table before sitting, as though she might be asked to take notes. She was in her 30s, plain, efficient, and utterly composed. You were Monsieur Harrowby's secretary, Poirot said. For 6 years, she replied. I managed his correspondence and household schedules. Did he trust you? Yes, she said simply. Did he like you? She hesitated, then answered carefully. Monsieur Harrowby did not like people. He found them useful. Poirot leaned forward slightly. And you? I was useful, she said. Poirot asked about the evening. Her account was exact, times, movements, conversations. Too exact. Like a report written in advance. You have a very good memory, Poirot remarked. I dislike disorder, she replied. Poirot inclined his head. So do I. Dr. Samuel Kersey arrived next. He was a broad-shouldered man with tired eyes and the habit of speaking in reassurance. His hands were steady, his voice calm, the voice of a man accustomed to delivering difficult news without emotion. You examined the body, Poirot said. Yes, Kersey replied. There was nothing suspicious. Lionel had a weak heart. Stress would have been enough. Stress, Poirot repeated. From where? Kersey exhaled. From being Lionel Harrowby. Poirot allowed a small smile. You were staying in the house? Yes. I was invited for the weekend. Lionel liked to have a doctor nearby. It made him feel secure. Did he appear anxious that night? No more than usual, Kersey said. He was quieter. Quieter. Poirot noted the word. The final guest was Thomas Reed, the pianist. He entered nervously, glancing at the piano visible through the open door of the adjoining room. He was young, talented, and clearly uncomfortable in a house where music had failed. You were to play for Monsieur Harrowby, Poirot said. Yes, Reed replied. At 8. He sent for me. And yet, no music was heard. Reed swallowed. He changed his mind. He said not to bother. His tone. Poirot asked. Flat, Reed said. As if he had already decided something. Poirot watched the young man closely. Fear, yes. Guilt, no. When the interviews were complete, Poirot remained alone in the morning room. 5 people. 5 calm faces. 5 accounts that agreed too easily. Inspector Webb returned. What do you think? Poirot did not answer at once. He stood and looked out over the lawn. The grass was undisturbed. No footprints. No sign of hurried movement. They all remained, Poirot said at last. Not because they were trapped, but because they chose to stay. People often stay after a death, Webb said. Yes, Poirot replied. But they usually cling to noise. To talking. To grief. He turned back. These people cling to silence. Webb frowned. Silence doesn't kill a man. Poirot's eyes were thoughtful, distant. No. But it can suffocate him. He walked slowly towards the corridor, where the untouched tea tray still Saturday. They are not united by affection, Poirot continued. Nor by hatred. They're united by something far more dangerous. And that is? Webb asked. Poirot stopped beside the tray. He touched the cold teacup with one gloved finger. Relief, he said softly. Inspector Webb stared at him. Poirot straightened his coat. Come, my friend. We must return to the music room. It is time to listen again, not to what is played, but to what was withheld. And as they walked away, the house remained perfectly still, as though it approved of their restraint. For now. Chapter 3, The Music That Was Never Played. The music room looked different by daylight, though Poirot could not at once have said why. At night it had seemed theatrical, almost ceremonial. Now, under the pale clarity of morning, it appeared exposed, like a stage stripped of its audience. Sunlight crept through the tall windows, catching dust motes that drifted lazily above the piano. The curtains were drawn back with care, tied evenly on both sides. Everything in the room spoke of balance and intention. Everything, Poirot thought, except life. He entered alone this time, Inspector Webb having been called away to the telephone. Poirot welcomed the solitude. Rooms, like people, revealed themselves best when not interrupted. He closed the door gently behind him and stood still. Silence settled immediately. Not the comfortable silence of peace, but the strained kind that followed an argument, when words had been said, or withheld, and could not be taken back. Poirot walked slowly around the room, his steps measured. He did not touch anything at first. He merely observed. The piano stood in the center, grand and immaculate. Its polished surface reflected the ceiling like dark water. The lid was raised. The keys lay exposed, white and black in perfect order. No sheet music. This, Poirot found curious. Harrowby had summoned a pianist. Even an impulsive man usually requested something specific. Yet there was no evidence of a chosen piece, no open book, no marked page. Poirot leaned closer. The keys were clean, too clean. Not the clean of careful maintenance, but of non-use. A pianist's fingers always left faint traces, even after a single piece. Here, there was nothing. So, Poirot murmured, the music was invited, but not allowed. He moved to the piano bench. It had been pushed back slightly, not abruptly, not in panic, but with care. A deliberate movement. The sort made by someone who expected to rise again, not someone struck down. Poirot sat, just for a moment. He placed his hands on his knees, resisting the impulse to touch the keys. He imagined Lionel Harrowby here. Upright. Waiting. Waiting for what? Poirot rose and crossed to the mantelpiece. The clock stood there like a frozen witness, its hands locked forever at 8:17. He examined it closely. The casing was undamaged. The glass uncracked. The mechanism intact. This was no accident. The clock had not stopped itself. Someone had stopped it. Or Poirot's eyes narrowed, someone had wanted time to stop. He wound the clock carefully. It ticked at once, brisk and obedient. Poirot stopped it again, returning the hands to their frozen position. Later, he said softly, Later, you will speak. On the small side table beside the piano stood a glass of water. Poirot lifted it gently, sniffed, and examined the rim. No residue. No mark of lipstick or trembling fingers. It had been held calmly. The water level suggested a few sips, nothing more. He replaced the glass precisely where it had been. Then Poirot noticed something that had escaped him the night before. The window. It was closed and latched, just as Inspector Webb had said. But the glass bore the faintest of marks, so slight they were almost invisible. A thin misted patch near the lower pane. Condensation. Breath against cold glass. Poirot smiled, but there was no warmth in it. A man who stands here, he said quietly, thinking. Breathing. Waiting. He turned and paced the room slowly, letting his mind reconstruct the evening. 8 o'clock. The pianist is summoned. Then dismissed. Why? Poirot imagined Harrowby's state of mind. A controlling man, accustomed to command. He would not cancel music lightly. Something had shifted. Not anger. There was no sign of disturbance. Not fear. The glass had not been spilled. Something colder. Realization. Poirot stopped pacing and looked again at the piano keys. He reached out now and pressed a single note, softly. The sound echoed briefly, then vanished. The room swallowed it whole. Poirot closed his eyes. This room, he realized, was not merely where Harrowby died. It was where Harrowby understood. Understood what? That question led Poirot back to the people. Clara Harrowby, with her carefully managed grief. Edmund Vale, smiling too easily. Margaret Quinn, precise and bloodless. Dr. Kersey, calm and certain. Thomas Reed, uneasy and frightened. 5 people. 5 different relationships with a dead man. And yet, Poirot frowned, they shared something. Not affection. Not hatred. Distance. Poirot moved to the door and opened it. The corridor beyond was empty, silent. He stepped out briefly and examined the carpet. No marks. No signs of hurried movement. This was a house where people moved carefully. Quietly. As though they had learned that noise carried consequences. He returned to the music room and closed the door again. Poirot now focused on what was missing. There was no sign of interruption. No struggle. No argument. Death had arrived without resistance. That alone troubled him deeply. A man does not simply die while seated at a piano, surrounded by others in the house, unless something within him has already surrendered. Poirot returned to the bench and sat once more. Monsieur Harrowby, he said aloud, as if addressing an invisible companion, you were not abandoned in this room. You were abandoned long before. He pictured Harrowby calling for attention, first through authority, then through irritation, then through silence of his own. And finding nothing returned. A controlling man could endure anger. He could endure rebellion. But indifference? That was intolerable. Poirot stood suddenly, his mind clicking into a new alignment. The pianist. Thomas Reed had been summoned, then dismissed. Why dismiss the one person whose presence would break the silence? Because Harrowby did not want music. He wanted response. Reaction. Proof that he still mattered. Poirot's gaze drifted again to the clock. 8:17. Why stop time at that precise moment? Not the moment of death, but the moment of decision. The moment when Harrowby realized no one was coming. Not his wife. Not his partner. Not his secretary. Not even a hired pianist. Poirot felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "This," he said softly, "is not a crime of violence. It is a crime of refusal." He reopened the door just as Inspector Webb returned. "You find something?" Webb asked. Poirot nodded slowly. "Yes. I found what was not here." Webb frowned. "That's not very helpful." Poirot smiled faintly. "On the contrary, my friend. It is everything." He gestured back at the piano. No music. No disturbance. No interruption. Only waiting. Webb crossed his arms. "You think he simply sat there until his heart failed?" Poirot looked at him steadily. "I think he sat there because he had nowhere else to go." Webb was silent. Poirot replaced his gloves with care. "Now," he said, "we must stop looking for the person who acted, and begin to understand the people who did not." As they left the room, Poirot glanced back once more at the piano. The keys waited patiently. Just as they had that night. And just as no one had come. Chapter 4, Perfect Alibis. By the afternoon, Bellmere House had resumed its peculiar imitation of normality. Lunch was served at the usual hour. Curtains were opened and closed with care. Footsteps remained soft, voices low. It was as if everyone had silently agreed that disruption itself was dangerous. Hercule Poirot observed all of this from a high-backed chair in the drawing-room, his posture elegant, his expression thoughtful. He had asked Inspector Webb for the written statements taken the previous night, and now he read them slowly, one by one, as though savoring each word. They were remarkably consistent. Tea at 7. General conversation. Nothing unpleasant. Nothing memorable. Poirot sighed softly. "When alibis are perfect," he murmured, "they are very often false." Inspector Webb looked up from his notes. "You think they rehearsed?" "No," Poirot replied. "That would imply effort. These stories required none." He folded the statements neatly and placed them aside. "Let us examine them together," Poirot continued. "Not for contradiction, but for character." They began with Clara Harrowby. Her account was brief. She had joined the others for tea, spoken little, and retired to her room shortly after 8, feeling tired. She had not seen her husband since earlier in the evening. She had felt no cause for concern. Poirot tapped the paper gently. "Observe, my friend. She tells us what she did, but not what she felt." Webb shrugged. "Some people are private." "Indeed," Poirot said. "But grief usually leaks. Hers does not." Next came Edmund Vale. He claimed to have spent the evening in pleasant conversation before returning to the smoking room. He had not heard any music. He had slept well. Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Slept well, in a house where the host dies?" Either Monsieur Vale is remarkably calm, or remarkably relieved. Webb frowned. "That's speculation." "Of course," Poirot replied mildly. "But speculation guided by psychology is simply observation with patience." Margaret Quinn's statement was the most detailed. Exact times. Exact locations. She had been in the library, then the corridor, then her room. She had noticed nothing unusual. Poirot smiled faintly. "Mademoiselle Quinn has given us a timetable, not a memory." "What's the difference?" Webb asked. "A memory," Poirot said, "contains confusion. A timetable does not." Dr. Kersey's statement followed. Professional, composed. He had seen Harrowby briefly that evening and noticed no distress. He had retired early. He had been summoned later when the body was found. Poirot traced one line with his finger. "Here." He notes that Monsieur Harrowby appeared quieter than usual. That is not a medical observation. That is a personal one. And finally, Webb said, the pianist. Thomas Reed's statement was emotional, uncertain. He admitted nervousness. He described being dismissed from the music room without explanation. Poirot nodded. The only one who doubts himself is the only one who tells the truth. Webb leaned back. All right. Suppose I accept that none of these alibis prove anything. That still leaves us nowhere. Poirot stood and walked to the window. Outside, the lawn lay undisturbed, the winter light pale and unforgiving. On the contrary, he said. It brings us very close. Webb joined him. Close to what? To motive, Poirot replied. But not the kind you expect. He turned from the window and faced Webb fully. Inspector, you have searched for anger, for greed, for fear. You have not found them because they are not what binds these people. Webb folded his arms. Then what does? Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead, he gestured for Webb to follow him. They walked through the house together, Poirot moving slowly, deliberately. He stopped outside the study, then the library, then the dining room. In each place, he pointed out the same thing. No signs of argument. No overturned chairs. No raised voices remembered. You expect a crime scene, Poirot said. But this house offers none. Because the crime did not erupt. It settled. They paused in the corridor outside the music room. The door remained closed, as though respecting the silence within. Poirot lowered his voice. Each of them had reason to resent Monsieur Harrowby. But resentment leads to confrontation, or escape. Neither happened, Webb said. Precisely, Poirot replied. Instead, they did something far more subtle. He returned to the drawing room and sat again. Let us consider the man himself, Poirot said. Lionel Harrowby controlled through attention. He rewarded obedience with approval and punished resistance with withdrawal. Webb nodded slowly. Staff mentioned that. He could be cold. Cold, Poirot repeated. Yes. And so the house learned coldness. He picked up a teacup from the tray that had been refreshed but again left untouched. They did not argue with him. They did not oppose him. They did not leave. They simply stopped responding. Webb stared at him. You're saying they ignored him to death? Poirot met his gaze. I am saying they denied him what he required most. And that is? Relevance, Poirot said softly. Silence followed his words. Not the heavy silence of the music room, but the thoughtful silence of understanding beginning to form. He called for the pianist, Poirot continued. Why? Not for pleasure. For proof that he could still summon reaction. But when the pianist arrived, Harrowby dismissed him. Webb frowned. Why would he do that? Poirot's eyes were sharp. Because the reaction he wanted did not come from the people who mattered. His wife had not followed him. His partner had not challenged him. His secretary had not sought his approval. Even the doctor treated him as a case, not a man. So, Poirot said, he sat down and waited. Webb shook his head slowly. That's not murder. No, Poirot agreed. It is something worse. He leaned forward. They did not kill him. They permitted him to discover that he no longer held power. Webb rubbed his jaw. And his heart could not bear the truth, Poirot finished. Another silence followed. But there is still the law, Webb said at last. You can't arrest people for neglecting someone's ego. Poirot smiled faintly. No. And that is why this case troubles you. He rose and straightened his coat. There will be no confession, he continued. Because there was no agreement. No meeting. No plan. Then how do you prove it? Webb asked. Poirot looked towards the closed music room door. You do not prove it, he said quietly. You reveal it. Webb watched him. How? Poirot's smile returned, thin, precise, unmistakably confident. You bring them together, he said. You give them silence again. And then? Webb asked. Poirot's eyes glinted with quiet certainty. Then, he said, you allow them to feel what killed Lionel Harrowby. He paused. And this time, Poirot added softly, they will not escape it. Chapter 5, The Red Herrings of Kindness. Inspector Webb spent the next 2 days doing exactly what he had been trained to do. He pursued suspects. He questioned Dr. Kersey again about medication, dosages, and timing. He examined Edmund Vale's finances with renewed interest. He reviewed Clara Harrowby's inheritance and the clauses of Lionel Harrowby's will. He even asked discreet questions about Margaret Quinn's loyalty and ambition. Each path appeared promising at first. Each collapsed just as neatly. Poirot watched all of this with quiet patience. You are fishing, he remarked one evening as Webb closed yet another notebook in frustration. And you are not. Webb snapped. Poirot smiled gently. I am watching the water. The house, meanwhile, continued its careful routine. Meals were served. Polite conversation occurred at fixed intervals. No one raised their voice. No one cried openly. Grief, like everything else in Bellmere House, was managed. It was Clara Harrowby who first drew renewed attention. She had inherited everything, house, investments, control of her late husband's estate. Webb pressed her harder, questioning her movements that evening, her marriage, her patience. At last she looked at him steadily and said, If I wanted my husband dead, Inspector, I would not have waited 8 years. Poirot, observing from the corner of the room, noted that her voice did not tremble. But neither did it harden. Her calm was not the calm of guilt. It was the calm of exhaustion. Edmund Vale, too, became the focus of suspicion. Old business disputes came to light. Arguments over money. A partnership dissolved under tension. Webb confronted him in the smoking room. You needed Harrowby out of the way, Webb said bluntly. Vale laughed, a short, incredulous sound. Out of the way? Inspector, Lionel Harrowby had been out of my way for years. He stayed in my life only because he enjoyed reminding me he could. Poirot noted the phrasing. Not anger. Not hatred. Resignation. Margaret Quinn endured her questioning with professional efficiency. She answered every question, produced every document, corrected Webb gently when he misremembered a date. You were devoted to him, Webb said. I was employed by him, she replied. And did you resent him? She considered this carefully. Resentment requires hope, she said. I had none. Dr. Kersey was equally unhelpful as a suspect. His examination of Harrowby's body was sound. His presence in the house explained. His manner sincere. There was nothing I could have done, he insisted. Lionel was not a man who listened. Poirot's eyes lingered on him. Not a man who listened. That evening, Poirot asked Inspector Webb to join him in the small library. Books lined the walls, law, philosophy, music theory. All arranged meticulously. Not one out of place. You see, Poirot said, gesturing around them, this house is full of kindness. Webb blinked. Kindness? Yes. Tea prepared. Rooms warmed. Invitations extended. Conversations held. He picked up a book and replaced it exactly where it had been. All the visible gestures of civility, Poirot continued. And yet, no intimacy. Webb frowned. You're saying they were polite, not kind. Poirot nodded. Exactly. He poured himself a small brandy and did not drink it. Each of these people, he said, has been suspected because each appears capable of cruelty. But you don't believe any of them acted alone, Webb said. On the contrary, Poirot replied. Each acted alone. That is the point. Webb stared at him. That makes no sense. Poirot turned to face him fully. Kindness can be a red herring, he said softly. It disguises the absence beneath it. He explained then, slowly and carefully. Lionel Harrowby had built his life on being necessary. He commanded attention. He demanded response. He enforced relevance. Over time, those around him learned that resistance only sharpened his control. Argument fed him. Emotion fed him. So they withdrew. Not dramatically. Not all at once. They answered later. They reacted less. They stopped rising to his provocations. Each of them, independently, discovered the same solution. Silence, Webb said. Poirot inclined his head. But silence dressed as politeness. The weekend of Harrowby's death had merely brought this truth into focus. He had summoned guests. He had arranged music. He had created a stage. And the audience had grown tired. They didn't plot, Webb said slowly. They didn't plan anything. No, Poirot agreed. Which is why the law cannot touch them. Webb ran a hand through his hair. Then what am I meant to write in my report? Poirot smiled faintly. That the death was natural. Webb's head snapped up. But the cause, Poirot said gently, was indeed cardiac failure. Webb stared at him. You're letting them walk away. Poirot's gaze hardened slightly. No, Inspector. They will carry this longer than any sentence. He rose and walked to the window. Outside, dusk settled again over Bellmere House. The greatest cruelty, Poirot continued, is not to strike a man down, but to let him realize he no longer exists in the minds of others. Webb was silent. That is what killed Lionel Harrowby, Poirot said. Not poison. Not violence. But the moment he understood that his power had vanished. Webb exhaled slowly. And the clock? A symbol, Poirot replied. He stopped time because, for him, there was nothing left to move towards. Webb looked down at his hands. I've spent my career chasing people who act. Poirot nodded. And now you have met people who refuse. A bell rang softly somewhere in the house, dinner being announced. Poirot turned away from the window. Tomorrow, he said, we bring them all together. For what purpose? Webb asked. Poirot's eyes were calm, but there was steel beneath them. To give them one final silence, he said. And to see who cannot bear it. The house, as if listening, remained perfectly still. Chapter 6, The Weight of Silence. Poirot chose the music room for the gathering, and he chose the hour with equal care. It was just after dusk, when the light outside failed but the lamps had not yet fully conquered the shadows. That uncertain time suited his purpose. People were less guarded when the day was gone and the night had not yet settled into confidence. The 5 guests arrived one by one. Hercule Poirot stood near the mantel, hands folded, his posture relaxed but alert. Inspector Webb took a position near the door, notebook in hand, uncertain what exactly he was meant to observe. Clara Harrowby entered first. She chose a chair near the window and sat with her back straight, hands folded, eyes fixed on the darkening garden beyond the glass. Edmund Vale followed, offering a polite nod to the room before seating himself opposite her. He crossed his legs, then uncrossed them, then crossed them again, as though unable to find a position that satisfied him. Margaret Quinn entered quietly and took the chair closest to the wall. She placed her notebook on her lap, though she did not open it. Dr. Kersey came next, his movements calm, professional, his face already composed in expectation of explanation. Last was Thomas Reed. He hesitated at the doorway, glanced at the piano, and then at Poirot, before taking a seat near the instrument. His fingers twitched faintly, as if remembering keys that had never been pressed. No one spoke. Poirot waited. The silence stretched, not long enough to be dramatic, but long enough to be uncomfortable. Chairs creaked. Someone cleared a throat and immediately stopped. Poirot raised his head. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said softly, "I have asked you here not to accuse, but to listen." No one responded. Poirot gestured toward the piano. On the evening of Monsieur Harrowby's death, this instrument was summoned, and then dismissed. Thomas Reed shifted. "He told me I wasn't needed." "Yes," Poirot agreed. Because he had already learned something. The silence deepened. Poirot walked slowly to the center of the room. "You have each given Inspector Webb very good accounts. Honest accounts. None of you lied." Margaret Quinn looked up sharply. Edmund Vale frowned. "And yet," Poirot continued, "none of you told the whole truth." Dr. Kersey folded his arms. "What truth is that?" Poirot turned to him. That Monsieur Harrowby was no longer answered. The words hung in the air. Poirot did not rush. He allowed the discomfort to settle. "You see," he went on, "there are many ways to harm a man. Some are violent. Some are loud. And some are very, very quiet." Clara Harrowby's fingers tightened in her lap. Poirot approached the piano and rested one hand lightly on its polished surface. "This room was prepared for an audience," he said. "Music arranged. Guests invited. Attention expected." He looked at each of them in turn. But no one came. Edmund Vale laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. "Are you suggesting we killed him by ignoring him?" Poirot met his gaze steadily. "I am suggesting you stopped feeding what sustained him." Margaret Quinn spoke for the first time. "That is not a crime." "No," Poirot agreed. "It is not." Inspector Webb shifted uneasily. Poirot raised a hand. "I do not speak of law. I speak of cause." He turned back to the group. Monsieur Harrowby governed through response. Approval, displeasure, command. He lived by reaction. And slowly, each of you learned that reaction was dangerous. Clara's voice was barely audible. He never listened. Poirot inclined his head. None. And so you learned not to speak. Thomas Reed swallowed. I was afraid of him. Of course, Poirot said gently. Fear teaches silence very well. Poirot returned to the mantel and pointed to the clock. He stopped time at 8:17. Not because he was dying, but because he was waiting. Dr. Kersey shook his head. Waiting for what? Poirot's voice softened. For proof that he still mattered. No one contradicted him. Poirot folded his hands behind his back. Each of you chose, independently, the same solution. You became polite. You became calm. You became distant. He looked at Edmund Vale. You smiled. At Margaret Quinn. You organized. At Dr. Kersey. You explained. At Clara Harrowby. You endured. And you, he said, turning to Thomas Reed, were dismissed because music could not give him what he wanted. The silence now was heavy, pressing down on the room like a weight. Poirot stepped back. Now, he said, I ask you to do something very simple. They looked at him warily. Sit, Poirot instructed, and say nothing. Inspector Webb opened his mouth, then closed it again. Poirot moved to the door and stood there, waiting. Seconds passed. Then a minute. The ticking clock, now restarted, filled the space with sound, marking time relentlessly. Edmund Vale shifted in his chair. Margaret Quinn stared straight ahead, jaw tight. Dr. Kersey glanced at the door, then away. Clara Harrowby's breathing became shallow. Thomas Reed looked as though he might bolt. Poirot said nothing. At last, Clara spoke. He was unbearable, she said suddenly. He drained everything. Poirot did not move. We tried, she continued, her voice trembling now. I tried. But nothing was ever enough. Poirot nodded once. Edmund Vale leaned forward. We didn't plan anything, he said. God help me, we didn't. No, Poirot said quietly. You merely stopped protecting him from himself. Margaret Quinn closed her eyes. I knew that night, she whispered. When he sent the pianist away. I knew he was alone. Dr. Kersey exhaled sharply. His heart couldn't withstand that shock. Poirot met his gaze. The heart is not only a muscle, Doctor. No one spoke after that. Poirot stepped aside and opened the door. You may go, he said simply. They rose slowly, as though leaving something behind them in the room. When the door closed, Inspector Webb let out a long breath. That was cruel, he said. Poirot looked at him calmly. Yes. And necessary, Webb added. Poirot adjusted his cuffs. Truth often is. He glanced once more at the piano. The hardest sound to endure, Poirot said softly, is silence that answers nothing. The clock continued to tick. And this time, no one stopped it. Chapter 7, The Unspoken Pact. Night settled fully over Bellmere House, and with it came a different kind of quiet. It was not the taut silence Poirot had summoned in the music room, nor the artificial calm of polite conversation. This was the silence that followed confession, not spoken aloud, but felt. The guests dispersed after the gathering without protest. No one lingered. No one sought reassurance. They moved through the corridors like people leaving a chapel after a difficult sermon, each absorbed in private reckoning. Poirot remained behind. He stood alone in the music room for a long while, listening to the clock tick steadily on the mantel. Time, once arrested, now moved with untroubled persistence. He welcomed the sound. It meant the house had relinquished at least one illusion. Inspector Webb returned quietly. They're all in their rooms, he said. No disturbances. Bien, Poirot replied. Disturbances are no longer required. Webb leaned against the door frame. I still don't know how to write this, he admitted. It feels unfinished. Poirot turned from the piano. It is finished. It is simply unresolved in the way you would prefer. Webb grimaced. You mean without charges? I mean without villains, Poirot said gently. They left the music room together and walked slowly along the corridor. Lamps cast pools of warm light on the carpet. Shadows clung to the corners. You called it an unspoken pact, Webb said. But if there was no agreement? Poirot raised a finger. A pact does not require words. Only understanding. He paused outside the library and gestured for Webb to follow him inside. The shelves loomed in orderly rows, the books standing to attention. Poirot selected one at random and opened it. "Observe," he said, pointing to the margins. No notes. No underlining. Monsieur Harrowby liked his possessions untouched. Perfect. Silent. He closed the book and returned it to its place. Each of them, Poirot continued, believed they were alone in their withdrawal. That is what makes this so effective and so terrible. Webb folded his arms. So none of them knew the others were doing the same thing. Not consciously, Poirot replied. But people sense these things. Silence spreads. They moved on, passing the study. Poirot stopped and looked inside. The desk was immaculate. Papers aligned. Pens arranged by size. Here, Poirot said, was the center of his control. Decisions made. Instructions issued. Webb nodded. And no one challenged him here. No, Poirot said. Eventually, no one came at all. They resumed walking. It began small, Poirot went on. A delayed reply. A neutral answer. A refusal to argue. Clara Harrowby had stopped protesting. Edmund Vale had stopped defending. Margaret Quinn had stopped advising. Dr. Kersey had stopped persuading. And when each person discovered that silence spared them pain, Poirot said, they kept it. Webb frowned. Self-preservation. OUI, Poirot agreed. But multiplied. They reached the staircase. Poirot rested a hand on the banister. By the time of that weekend, he said, the pact was complete, though none would have named it. They were united not by intent, but by relief. Webb looked troubled. That's still not killing. Poirot's gaze sharpened slightly. Tell me, Inspector, if 5 people stand by a river and watch a man struggle, each believing someone else will act, what do you call it when no one does? Webb hesitated. Tragedy. Poirot nodded. And sometimes, tragedy wears the mask of civility. They descended the stairs and paused near the front door. Outside, the night pressed against the glass. I want to understand something, Webb said quietly. That moment, when Harrowby dismissed the pianist. Why then? Poirot considered this. Because that was the moment he understood the pattern, he said at last. He had called for reaction and received none from those who mattered. Webb nodded slowly. So he stopped trying. Yes, Poirot said. And that is the most dangerous moment for a man like Lionel Harrowby. They stood in silence again, but it no longer felt oppressive. It felt honest. Footsteps approached. Margaret Quinn appeared at the end of the hall. She hesitated when she saw them, then continued forward. Monsieur Poirot, she said. May I speak with you? Poirot inclined his head. Of course. Inspector Webb stepped aside, pretending to examine a painting. Margaret's voice was low. I didn't plan anything, she said. None of us did. I know, Poirot replied. But when you asked us to sit in silence, she swallowed. It felt familiar. Poirot's eyes softened. Yes. That night, she continued, when he sent the pianist away, I knew he was waiting. I knew it mattered. Did you go to him? Poirot asked gently. She shook her head. No. Why not? She closed her eyes. Because I was tired. Poirot nodded. Fatigue is powerful. She opened her eyes. Will you tell them? Poirot understood what she meant. No, he said quietly. They already know. She left without another word. Webb returned. She won't be the last. No, Poirot agreed. But there will be no more confessions. They prepared to retire for the night. At the foot of the stairs, Webb paused. "Do you ever feel dissatisfied?" he asked. "When justice doesn't look like justice?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Justice is a human invention. Truth is not." Upstairs, the house settled. In his room, Poirot prepared for bed with meticulous care. He removed his cufflinks, brushed his moustache, and folded his clothes precisely. Before extinguishing the lamp, he sat on the edge of the bed and reflected. Lionel Harrowby had not been murdered in anger or greed. He had not been poisoned, stabbed, or struck down. He had been erased, slowly, politely, and completely. Poirot lay back and closed his eyes. Tomorrow, the case would end. The law would be satisfied. The house would return to stillness. But the unspoken pact, formed without words, sealed without intent, would endure far longer. And in that knowledge, Poirot knew, none of them would ever again find true silence comfortable. Not ever. Chapter 8. Poirot's Judgment. Morning arrived at Bellmere House with a clarity that felt almost intrusive. Sunlight entered boldly through the tall windows, touching polished wood and pale walls as though insisting on visibility where secrecy had lived too long. The house looked unchanged, yet something essential had shifted. Silence no longer ruled it, it merely occupied it. Hercule Poirot stood in the entrance hall, hat in hand, waiting for Inspector Webb. He had slept well, though his dreams had been filled with ticking clocks and unplayed notes. Such symbols no longer troubled him. They had said what they needed to say. Inspector Webb descended the stairs, his expression serious, his movement slow. "They're ready," he said. "All of them?" Poirot nodded. "Then let us conclude." The drawing room had been arranged for the occasion. Chairs were placed in a semicircle, carefully spaced, as though to prevent intimacy. The 5 guests entered quietly and took their seats. Clara Harrowby sat upright, composed but pale. Edmund Vale wore a face of polite expectation. Margaret Quinn held her notebook but did not open it. Dr. Kersey folded his hands, professional and guarded. Thomas Reed remained near the door, as if ready to leave at a moment's notice. Inspector Webb stood to one side. Poirot took the center. "My friends," Poirot began calmly, "this is not a trial. There will be no accusations. No arrests." A visible release of breath passed through the room, though not relief, something heavier. Poirot continued. "Monsieur Harrowby died of heart failure. The medical cause is undisputed." Dr. Kersey nodded. "But," Poirot said gently, "a cause is not always a reason." He allowed the words to settle. "You have each asked yourselves the same question," Poirot went on. "Could I have done something?" The answer is yes. And also, no. Edmund Vale frowned. "That's not very comforting." "No," Poirot agreed. "Truth rarely is." He walked slowly, deliberately, allowing his presence to command attention without demanding it. Lionel Harrowby believed himself powerful because he could provoke response. He measured his worth by reaction. Praise, anger, fear, it was all the same to him, so long as it proved he mattered. Poirot stopped behind Clara Harrowby. When those responses faded, he said, he did not adapt. He waited. Clara's lips trembled, but she did not speak. "You did not conspire," Poirot continued. "You did not decide together. That is what makes this so difficult." He moved to Edmund Vale. "You withdrew to protect yourself." To Margaret Quinn. "You maintained order to survive." To Dr. Kersey. "You treated symptoms, not the man." To Thomas Reed. You obeyed because obedience was safer than engagement. Poirot returned to the center. Each choice was reasonable. Each was human. Inspector Webb shifted. Then what exactly are we saying here? Poirot turned to him. We are saying that a man died when he realized that no one was coming. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily. Poirot raised a hand. I will not speak of guilt. That belongs to conscience, not to courts. He looked at each of them carefully. But I will speak of responsibility. Margaret Quinn closed her eyes. Responsibility, Poirot said softly, is what remains when blame dissolves. He gestured toward the piano, visible through the open door. He sat there, Poirot continued, not because he was abandoned, but because he believed someone would arrive. A wife. A colleague. A voice. No one interrupted him. When no one did, his heart failed. Not from shock. From recognition. Poirot's voice softened. That moment, when a person understands they no longer exist in the emotional world of others, can be fatal. Thomas Reed whispered, I thought he'd call again. Poirot nodded. He did. In the only way he knew. He turned to Inspector Webb. You will record this as a natural death. Webb hesitated. And if my superiors ask questions? Poirot smiled faintly. They always do. And they will receive answers. Webb nodded slowly. Poirot faced the group once more. I leave you with this, he said. Silence is not neutral. It is a choice. No one argued. Poirot adjusted his cuffs. I do not judge you as criminals. I judge you as people. He paused, then added quietly, and that is often harder. The meeting ended without ceremony. One by one, the guests rose and left the room. Clara Harrowby lingered. Monsieur Poirot, she said softly. If I had gone to him that night. Poirot met her gaze kindly. You cannot rewrite the past, madam. Only the future. She nodded and left. Inspector Webb walked Poirot to the door. Outside, the day was bright and cold. You solved it, Webb said. And yet it feels unresolved. Poirot put on his gloves. Some endings are not meant to satisfy. They are meant to instruct. Webb hesitated. Would you have acted differently? Poirot paused. I would have listened sooner, he said. The motorcar arrived. Poirot stepped inside, then looked back once at Bellmere House. The windows reflected the sky. The clock ticked. The piano remained silent. As the car drove away, Poirot allowed himself a rare moment of sadness. Not for Lionel Harrowby, but for the terrible efficiency with which people learn to protect themselves. Even when the cost is another human being fading into silence. And that, Poirot knew, was a mystery no detective would ever fully solve.